Good morning again, everyone. On behalf of Contemplative Outreach of Maryland and Washington, I wish to welcome you all to our November half-day retreat. This is our 9th retreat of the year, and we're glad to have you with us today. Please be reminded that we're recording today's teaching as well as the question and answer session of the program. When I say we, I'm referring to the able assistance of Ellen Barlow, who's here with us but working in the background, and whose technical support will be essential throughout. Our retreat this morning is titled Thomas Keating and the Snowmass Dialogue. Let us just do a quick overview of today's program. At 9 to 9:10, we're doing the introduction now. And from 9:10 to 9:40, we'll do our first centering prayer sit. From 9:40 to 10:40, Netanel will give his talk. Then we'll take a break, a silent break where everybody could get up and stretch a little bit. And then we'll be back at 10:50 promptly for our question and answer, which will run until 11:20. From 11:20 to 11:50, we'll do our second centering prayer sit. And then at 11:50 to 12, we'll have the closing remarks and the final blessing. Please join me in welcoming our ComW retreat leader today, Professor Netanel Miles-Yepez.
Thank you. Thank you.
Net is an artist, philosopher, religion scholar, and a spiritual teacher. He's considered a leading thinker in the interspiritual and new monasticism movements. After studying history of religions at Michigan State University, he moved to Colorado to study contemplative religions at the Naropa Institute. He was a close student of the innovative Hasidic master and leader in the ecumenical dialogue, Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement, and Father Thomas Keating, Trappist monk and founder of the Centering Prayer Movement. Professor Miles-Yepez has authored or edited over 30 books. Welcome, Netanel. We're so glad to have you as our speaker this morning.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
For those of you who may be joining us for the first time or are new to centering prayer, I will read its core guidelines. Choose a sacred word as a symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. Sitting comfortably with eyes closed, settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. When engaged with thoughts, return ever so gently to your sacred word. At the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a minute or two. Netanel will lead us into our first sit with an opening prayer. Then you will hear 3 gongs to get us started. To indicate the end of our first 30-minute sit, you will also hear 3 gongs. Then we will hold a brief period of silence. Netanel.
O God, unto whom all hearts lie open, unto whom desire is eloquent, and from whom no secret thing is hidden, purify the thoughts of my heart by the outpouring of your Spirit, that I may love you with a perfect love and praise you as you deserve. Amen. It's always interesting to come out of silence. It's connected to dialogue because the dialogue that happens after a period of silence like that is different than the dialogue that would happen without it. And hopefully that's true of whatever we speak now. So thank you for hosting me and asking me to come speak. I think I've said I've talked about Father Thomas and the Snowmass dialogues. So perhaps the place to begin is with how I was first introduced to Father Thomas. I first saw him, I believe, in 1999. I was a graduate student at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, where I now teach. And my major professor at the end of a class said, "You have a really special opportunity. There is at this moment, in another room here on the campus, Father Thomas Keating. And he's going to give a talk, and, if you hurry over there, you'll have a really special opportunity." And so I did, and I had never heard of Thomas Keating at that point. And there was a very tall man. I believe Father Thomas was 6'6" at his full height. And in his wonderful Cistercian robes. And he was on a little stage, and the Naropa Institute was founded by a Tibetan Buddhist master. And so some of its traditions are influenced by Tibetan Buddhism. And so on that stage with him was a lovely chair that was covered in Tibetan brocade. And I remember Father Thomas was standing there next to the chair, eyeing it like a curiosity, and put his hand on it, thought about sitting in it, and then decided he could not sit in this grand chair. And asked somebody to get a chair to sit on the floor with the rest of us. And there was a large group in there, probably 100 people. And luckily for me, they put a chair, an ordinary chair, down where we were sitting, and they seated him right in front of me. We were almost knee to knee. And then he gave a talk that was based on Matthew 6:6. If you want to pray, enter your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And it was an amazing little talk. I now understand that, those of us who give talks develop themes and explore them in our talks and grow them and change them over time. And I now realize this was one of Father Thomas's talks. It finally ends up in his book, Manifesting God. I think the chapter is called Prayer in Secret. But it was the perfect talk for me at the perfect moment. I had been on a journey away from Christianity at that point. Not for any sense of disappointment, not for any anger. I was a devoted Christian and not unhappy with my relationship with Jesus. It was just that I was led on an unfolding path. I had learned at the point I was actually thinking of going to seminary, I'd learned that my family was also Jewish. One of those crypto-Jewish families from Spain that had been forced to convert and who had kept a secret Jewish tradition through the centuries, actually. And that led me into an exploration of religion and a wider sense of religion. And so I had been away for quite a while. And the Christianity I'd known as a young man had its limitations. And so while I was not disaffected Christian, I also felt I was graduating the kind of limited version that had been taught to me as a boy. And here was an adult Christianity, deep and contemplative, rich in its perspective. And those were the perfect words to lead me back in, because I was exploring meditation very deeply at that time also. And so I had a minor revolution in my spiritual life, in which I could return to Christianity, not as I was, but as a new person and who I needed to be now. I don't think I saw him again for another 3 years. I was a student of another very famous spiritual teacher, somewhat parallel to Father Thomas. His name was Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, one of the pioneers of interfaith dialogue and the leader of a movement within Judaism to renew Jewish practice and life. And that relationship led me back to Father Thomas, actually, because Reb Zalman would really take care of me. And as a talented young man, he saw to it that I had opportunities. And in 2002, I was hired by a man named Dr. Edward Bastian, who had founded what was called then the Spiritual Paths Institute. And the Spiritual Paths Institute intended to hold what it called interspiritual gatherings, in which you had the opportunity in a public program to meet those great exemplars like Father Thomas or Reb Zalman and so on. And so I met Father Thomas again in 2002 at, I think, a program that was called The Way of Meditation. And I was hired to help bring the speakers together, to edit the things that they, the public talks they gave, to edit them for a book, to generally help organize. And this was my reconnection with Father Thomas. And I think from that point forward, from 2002, for the next 16 years until his passing, he would be a major influence in my life. And I called him my spiritual uncle. I saw him less often than my other teacher, Reb Zalman, but it seemed like I was always checking in with Father Thomas. The spiritual paths programs that he was a part of were an outgrowth of his Snowmass conferences. The founder of Spiritual Paths, Edward Bastian, that I mentioned, had been a member of the Snowmass Conference since 1999. And inspired by what he found there, he himself was a Buddhist practitioner, but inspired by what he saw there, he saw a way to bring the kind of intimacy of dialogue that happened at the Snowmass Conference into a public program, which is a bit of an irony, and I'll talk about that later. But the way in which it was very similar to a Snowmass Conference was we would all stay together in the same house, maybe in Aspen or somewhere else in Southern California, share meals together, take walks, spend a lot of time together. And then there would be a public program where there would be offerings from each of the spiritual teachers and a public dialogue. But that kind of intimacy of time spent together in private was very much like the Snowmass conferences and very much informed the quality of the dialogue that happened in public. As I got to know Father Thomas better, I learned that he had been himself interested in dialogue for a very long time. And that while at this stage of his life, he was a famous spiritual teacher and known for centering prayer and the development of centering prayer, that one of his great private joys was to engage in dialogue with other spiritual teachers. And from my perspective and my conversations with him, it was an equal joy that part of his life mission he felt very clearly to be in the development of centering prayer and to speak about centering prayer, and especially the contemplative life that unfolds from it, and how to grow that life and how to approach one's self-understanding. And those, as he called them, those programs for happiness that we get involved with. But his other great passion and mission was around doing dialogue with people from other religions and being involved in a joint exploration together. I don't know at what point he exactly began to do this work. In some ways, he was always doing this work because he was a contemplative, a true contemplative. There's a way in which you can do your spirituality religiously and not be a contemplative, which is to say, we can be good children and do as we're told and do what is right according to how we're told to do it. And the lessons can perhaps not sink that deeply. And that is just not what he was in for. He was a passionate pursuer of the journey. And so from his time as a novice monk, through becoming a very young abbot and being voted abbot for life, while he was still very young, at no point was he off of that journey. And so that great exploration, that great inner journey was powerful for him. He was a great reader of John of the Cross and knew these writings in depth. And I think the thing about, if there's a connection between centering prayer and dialogue, it's that for Father Thomas, on that inward journey and in those deeps, those greater inner depths that you reach, you pass thresholds that are connected to the externals of religion, and you reach the places potentially that are the source from which they all come, the place of the mystery. And I think for him, having reached that place, you come into a deeper relationship to the mystery, a love affair with the mystery. And when you really identify it as such, then you want to know as much about that mystery as possible, which sounds like a fool's errand, trying to explore the mystery, because as the word suggests, it's not like a mystery novel. The original Greek is not a thing that you can, that's hiding behind a veil and you can pull the veil and discover it, or you get to the end of the mystery novel and you figure out who done it. a mystery from the Greek is never not a mystery. Mystery always remains a mystery. By its very nature, it is mysterious. And so there's no whodunit behind it, which is not to say that you can't come into relationship with it, a fuller, deeper relationship with it, and that there isn't more to know in a sense. And coming into a love affair with the mystery, well then, inasmuch as that mystery is identified with God, you want to know God in all God's manifestations. And I think he became intensely curious about how God worked all over the planet in every manner, and in the expressions of God in other religions. And there was no sense of dissatisfaction with his own, or no lack of confidence about its transformative potential. It actually, his exploration came from a place of confidence, where there's no fear of being undermined. There's only more to learn about God. And so this got him into quite a bit of trouble, actually, as it tends to do, because these two things were developing parallel. You know, Father William Meninger, within the monastery at St. Joseph's, where Father Thomas was abbot, had rediscovered a wonderful text, and I read the prayer from it, from the Cloud of Unknowing, this morning before we did our centering prayer. And Father William, in rediscovering this text, Father William told me, as he told many people, that I remember maybe in 2005, he said he'd read it 200 times. I'm sure by the time he passed, you know, not that long ago, I think maybe it was last year or the year before, it may have been up to 300. I don't think he ever stopped reading The Cloud of Unknowing. And in that very close reading, Father William, who was meeting more people who were talking about meditation through the 60s and 70s, began to understand that there was a meditation technique that was implicit in the text, and sometimes explicitly spoken about, but you wouldn't necessarily see it unless you already knew something about meditation. And he began to comb out those passages, chapter 3, chapter 7, there are other passages, you know, chapters that had specific passages that were relevant, and began to cultivate this technique that we now call centering prayer within the monastery. And that kind of big four, Father William Meninger, Father Theophane Boyd, Father Basil Pennington, and Father Thomas as abbot, really cultivated together this practice and began to offer it within the monastery, especially to retreatants, and sometimes less to the monks. And so that was developing within the monastery. But another parallel development, and I think I've explained how this might have come about, was that Father Thomas started to invite leaders of other religious traditions to come speak to the monks, and sometimes lead them in other processes of meditation. Excuse me, it's earlier here and I haven't spoken to anybody today but you. And so he would have in Theravadan Buddhist monks like Ajahn Chah, a very famous Buddhist meditation teacher, old school, you know, to teach meditation and make this available to the monks. Or the Zen Buddhist meditation master, Sasaki Roshi, to lead the monks in a Zen sesshin, sesshin being a very intensive period of meditation. And sometimes these masters from other traditions were themselves surprised by the environment because they're discovering a Christianity of seriousness that parallels their own tradition, because they're monks too. And so they're seeing a monasticism, sorry, excuse me, of robed individuals whose entire life is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, their engagement with their spirituality. And so there's a lot of cross-fertilization, and of course these masters are having dialogue with Father Thomas privately, and then sometimes a delightful dialogue. And in one case, one master wanted to make himself acceptable to the environment, and so asked for Cistercian robes to put on while they practiced together. And much to the dismay of many, Father Thomas obliged him. And so you had this Japanese Zen Buddhist master wearing Cistercian robes in the monastery at one point and leading meditation. And for some, this scandalized them. And so I think this is important to mention because this kind of thing, and not this entirely, led to Father Thomas leaving St. Joseph's Abbey. It built up tensions in the monastery. For some, he had an odd reputation. On the one hand, some monks thought he was too hard on them about their contemplative practices, really pushing the inner journey and asking a lot of them. And many thought too much in terms of their Christianity, in terms of their contemplative Christianity. They thought he was too hard on them. On the other hand, the same monks might say that he's not Christian enough. Why is he even dialoguing with people of other religions? And so it was a very odd complaint. One, he wants us to be too Christian, and on the other hand, he's not Christian enough. And these tensions built to a place where, as many of you may know, he said, well, if you're dissatisfied, why don't you vote? On whether I should be abbot. And that vote came back 50-50. And I think that was heartbreaking. That is not a vote of confidence. We're barely together. And he resigned. And what may have looked like the end was really the beginning. And he told me in many private conversations that being abbot was not fun. He says you take all the problems that you have in the world and all the personality conflicts, and then you put them in a box with very high walls, and all those problems come out in these personalities, and they rise very high. And the abbot is at the center. And he says it's a difficult role and not enjoyable. And so when he left it, he felt free to explore what he really wanted to explore. And he did. And two interesting things happen around that time. He gets to invest again in his own spiritual life. He's invited to teach many places. And two parallel things develop again. His interest in and pursuit of dialogue with other religious traditions. And this is also the period in which centering prayer takes off with him as a leading figure. So he takes himself off to Lama Foundation in New Mexico, in Cuesta, New Mexico, which had really started as a spiritual hippie commune, a very odd place for him to end up. But it was also known as a place where people of many different religious traditions, and especially, today we have a lot of spiritual celebrities, people that have been on Oprah. And, those many people think of those as the great spiritual teachers of today. However, from where I sit, I know that there's a band of people that are less famous, but truly great. And that was true in that time too. And Father Thomas was among them. And often those truly greats, many of them ended up at Lama Foundation in one way or another, teaching small programs. And as we know, the small program that Father Thomas taught there was to teach a small group of people centering prayer. That very small group of people became the leadership of centering prayer. I had the wonderful opportunity this summer of meeting Pat Johnson, who was living at Lama at that time, I think maybe in her late 40s with 9 children. And she was just serving that retreat, making sure that they were fed, and then got herself into it. And, the great opportunity of meeting her was seeing what the goal is for a life of practice. This woman is amazing. And a real exemplar to us, because she did have 9 children, some of them with special needs that she had to serve until very late in her life, more than a parent often would. And the contemplative depth that just radiates around her is amazing. And she represents the possibility for doing that, not in a monastery, but in our ordinary lives. So she served that retreat, and as we know, centering prayer develops out of that. He's also accepting invitations to participate in dialogues, and in 1981, a series of dialogues are started that became very significant. I mentioned the Naropa Institute already. That's where I first saw Father Thomas. It was where I was a graduate student. And I've been a student of the history of religions, as it's called in academia, since I was in my early 20s. And I'd gone to the Naropa Institute to continue those studies, specifically to learn about Buddhism. So I was doing my master's work in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist studies. And doing that there because the Naropa Institute was a pretty interesting, rare place. In the Tibetan diaspora that follows the Chinese invasion of Tibet, so many Tibetan Buddhist masters were forced to become refugees, fleeing to India and elsewhere. A very traumatic event for them. Among them, the Dalai Lama. And also a very radical sort of Tibetan Buddhist master, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Interestingly enough, both the Dalai Lama and Trungpa Rinpoche had run into Thomas Merton in India, and both had very significant encounters with him. Trungpa Rinpoche would have been a very young monk at that time. And in fact, Merton and Trungpa Rinpoche ran into each other because they were sitting on bar stools next to each other in a bar in Calcutta and struck up a conversation. Turned out both was a master of their tradition. But part of the impact of that conversation with this young monk, Trungpa Rinpoche, was that he was amazed to find that here was somebody from a tradition that he had not been taught to respect, who was of great spiritual depth. And that can be an eye-opening and awakening moment when you realize there is parallel depth across the fence, and you hadn't necessarily been taught to expect that. And they hit it off so big that they were talking about writing a book together, Thomas Merton and Trungpa Rinpoche, about the parallel teachings that were available. And so, as we all know, Merton did not live a great deal longer after that visit to the East. But Trungpa Rinpoche never forgot that encounter. And he eventually made his way to the United States and started a pretty interesting Tibetan Buddhist community in Boulder, Colorado, where I now am, and had a vision for starting a school that was not meant to be a school, a Buddhist school. Today it's now Naropa University. We call it a Buddhist-inspired university. But that's not even what he intended. After meeting Merton, he had a vision of a place of convening almost, where all the religions could be represented and could dialogue together, and a student could come and learn in depth about any particular tradition that is available on the planet. And he wanted to be a place of dialogue. It has become that and not through the years. It keeps aspiring to that. But part of that early vision, the Naropa Institute was founded in 1974, kicked off with a major dialogue between Trungpa Rinpoche and Ram Dass. But by 1981, he was witnessing that his young American students who were Buddhist, now Buddhist converts, many of them former Catholics and former Jews, most of them, he felt like there was something problematic for them, that in some ways it's hard to grow, even for a convert, a mature practice, say within Buddhism, if you're still running from where you came from, if you're running from your Catholicism, and you haven't come to terms with that. You'll bring your rebellion in some form or another into your new tradition. And so that's a powerful insight. And so Trungpa Rinpoche initiated a series of dialogues that happened for the next 7 years, called the Buddhist Christian Dialogues at the Naropa Institute. That's a very long introduction, but Father Thomas was invited because he wanted these young Buddhists to meet Christians of parallel depth to the Buddhist teachers they might meet. And these dialogues in the history of dialogue were tremendously impactful, largely because of the quality of the people invited. Brother David Steindl-Rast, William McNamara, Mother Tessa Bilecki, Father Thomas, and the Zen teachers and the Buddhist, the Tibetan Buddhist teachers were of parallel capacity. And so wonderful dialogues, amazing, a big part of Naropa's history for me as a professor there. For Father Thomas, they were wonderful. This was just what he wanted to be doing. But he had a critique of what was happening very quickly. So he'd been involved with them for the first 3 years, 81 through 83. And by 83, he had an issue. And it was that there was a wonderful intimacy that would happen before the public programs. They might be having lunch together and talking about this and that and be very friendly and collegial. And then the public program would start and they would be put on a stage in chairs facing an audience, addressing the audience, and not talking to each other. And all the intimacy was gone. Now it's somewhat of a performance, having to represent, having to wear the particular hat of your tradition or habit, and to speak from the habit and not from your personal experience, because cameras were on and things were being recorded. And there was a sense that you could not be yourself authentically. You were in the position of having to do a good job for Cistercian Christianity, or basic Benedictine Christianity, or whatever it might be, good Carmelite now, or good, Orthodoxy. And he was in for the intimacy. He was in for the questions. He was in for the conversation between them, not to an audience as an expert. That's a burden he had to carry sometimes, to be the expert and to represent, but it wasn't what he wanted. My own other teacher, Reb Zalman, who was in those early days of dialogue too, participated in what the young hippies used to call holy man jams. And they were that patriarchal. They, in those days, were all men on the stage, and they'd call them holy man jams. And he too had a similar insight. He would tell me that he realized they were all sitting on a stage, staring at an audience, addressing the questions of the audience like they were authorities. And they were. And yet it wasn't tremendously fulfilling for them. A big ego boost to be the authority, and good for an audience in those days to see people of other religions sitting together, but they weren't necessarily talking to each other. And so Reb Zalman told me, he said during one event, when the microphone was passed to him, he pointed this out and turned to his colleagues and said, why don't maybe it's more significant to show people at an earlier stage of the path that we have questions, that we have things that we're exploring and trying to figure out, and maybe they could learn from our questions. And so he said, I'll start. And he started talking about his own vulnerabilities and his own questions. And then he said, unfortunately, the rest of the gurus spent the rest of the time just answering his questions instead of being vulnerable and talking about their own questions. He said, with the exception of Brother David Steindl-Rast, who could also make himself vulnerable in public. So it kind of shows you what Father Thomas was facing, and it gave him an idea. And he began to explore this idea through the rest of 1983, planning something for 1984. And it was to invite the quality of teachers that he found in these dialogues back to Snowmass, back to St. Benedict's in Snowmass, Colorado, where he was now resident and where he had once been the novice master. And Father Thomas helped build that place. And some of his father's money went into helping to build that monastery. And so he was now inviting a number of teachers from as many religions as he could, of as great a quality as he could, back to the monastery and here's the great innovation. We had dialogues. I don't know if you could call them dialogues since they were mostly addressing the audience. But their dialogue was happening. But now he took it out of the arena of public performance and into a private retreat for high-level teachers of multiple religions. And I don't think this has ever happened in the history of religion. So 1984 is a big year. That 12 representatives of different traditions should come to the same place to talk and meditate and pray together is a major event in the history of all our religions. That's the great innovation, that there was a desire not just to talk to the public and represent a good possibility for peace, but to actually make peace and actually explore their own spiritual lives together with maybe the only people they could do it with, peers. The more well-known you become as a spiritual teacher, whatever that means, the lonelier it gets, you know? Um, you know, the happiest days are the days you spend talking with spiritual friends about the journey and your struggles. And the more you get put on top of the pyramid, the lonelier you get. You know, the days of the friendship are much better, much more enjoyable. So, you know, when does a Father Thomas, where are his peers? You know, they're few and far between. Where's he going to find them? And when is he going to get together with them to take off the hat and speak from the heart? Now, as it turned out, he still stayed a bit on top of the pyramid, even in such groups. He was a pretty rare spiritual practitioner. Even if you get a group of 12 together, he still tended to stand higher. He was 6'6", so had something to do with it. But here they are, gathered out of the public, not on the stage representing anything, and they're going to be together for a week. And the first thing they have to decide, and they don't know how to do any of this because it's never been done. And so their first conversation's about, what are we doing? How are we going to speak to one another? Questions like, should we record this? And there was an indigenous elder, he'd be called Lakota Sioux now, Grandfather Gerald Red Elk. And Grandfather Gerald Red Elk said, he says, let's not record. It's so clear that so many people here can't feel safe enough to utter their real opinions because of the trouble they might get in from the bishop or whoever that, you know, whatever that role might be in their tradition. And so we can't speak our minds if we're worried about being recorded. I don't think that it's the same anymore, to some degree, but in those days it was definitely true. You could definitely get in trouble. I remember Father William Meninger telling me that he just loved to talk about the Enneagram, but he was always constantly getting in trouble for it. You know, so, you know, we have those difficulties. So they decided not to record, and Grandfather Red Elk says, you know what? If the world needs what we say, it will be remembered and it will come through somehow. And we should trust that. And, you know, here's the book, The Common Heart. It came through. Turns out that there was a self-described ace note taker, somebody who had been a stenographer, who was sitting there as a witness, and she took fantastic notes, and thank God for me, legible. So for those first sessions, I, as the editor of this book, had access to pretty clear versions of what they said to each other. Today, we look at the Snowmass Conference as probably the longest running continuous interfaith or interspiritual dialogue, and a very unique one, as I've already mentioned, a dialogue retreat. And usually for spiritual teachers to take off the hat intentionally and not be teachers teaching at one another, but becoming resources for learning from one another. And over time, if you look at the book, you'll see there are a few aspects that made this retreat work. And one of those aspects they determined was the correct environment, not on a public stage. They were willing to do that, and they did it a couple of times, but realized it shifted things remarkably, and they did not enjoy it. So they sought out a contemplative environment. You know, we now call them the Snowmass dialogues. They did not all happen at Snowmass, but later they happened there consistently. The first one happened there, and then most of the later ones happened there. But through some experimentation, they realized over time they needed to be in a cultivated contemplative environment. If any of you have ever been out, and I imagine many of you have, out to St. Benedict's in Snowmass, Colorado, when you get to the sign that says 1012 Monastery Road, and you drive up that road and into that bowl-shaped valley where the monastery is, it's like you pass a threshold into a kind of peacefulness that was not available even on the beautiful road out to that point. And that's a very special atmosphere that is not accidental. That's cultivated. At the Naropa Institute, we have a meditation hall. And you can open the door in that room and pass from one atmosphere into a completely different atmosphere, an atmosphere of radiant peacefulness. That happens, it's a kind of magic that happens through cultivated spiritual practice and intentional spiritual practice in an atmosphere that creates an atmosphere. And so they needed to seek out those environments. And so they tended to meet at monasteries. The one time they did it at a university, it was awful. I can tell you. So they came back to right environment, spiritual centers, places of cultivated contemplative practice. It makes a difference for the quality of the dialogue. Father Thomas put a lot of care into trying to find the right people to dialogue with. And in as much as I've continued these dialogues now, me and a partner, they go on this lineage of dialogue. You're not just looking for the names, the people with, reputations who've written various books, but you look for the people with a reputation for a capacity to talk to one another and to not be a teacher. They are teachers, but we're not there to teach each other. And sometimes you watch this is remarkably hard for some people. They can't stop teaching everybody else. And so he was looking for those people that had a capacity to take the hat off and talk in dialogue, and did really well. If you look at the first list of names, these are impressive folks. Gayatri Devi, Grandfather Gerald Red Elk. Some of them became famous later, Pema Chodron, the Buddhist teacher, so on. Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who's a pretty fun guy. It's a great list of names. Bernie Glassman Roshi. So the participants matter, how you choose them. 3, that it should be a private retreat. We need to get away. Many of them just needed vacations, frankly. Father Thomas, for the entire time I knew him, needed a vacation. And you'd say, well, he lived in a monastery. But people constantly were drawing on him as a resource. He was tired. And in some sense, the Snowmass dialogues were always a little vacation for him. And, when you're a spiritual professional, it's like sometimes you don't want to meditate on your vacation. That's what you do all the time. It's all you ever talk about. They did meditate and pray together, but it was a time for long walks and good meals and relaxing talk. And not a session, not an intensive for them, though it could be fairly intense. You do a lot of dialogue sessions and a lot of practice together, but it's not the purpose. So this private retreat that is a little bit vacation for spiritual professionals. 4, they kind of accidentally began to meet in a circle. And the circle turns out to be important. It's among our oldest spiritual technologies. And from the time we had a first fire, we had stories and we had a circle. And that's what they began to do. They began to tell their stories as if around a spiritual fire. Because where are you going to begin? So the first question that's usually explored at a Snowmass dialogue is, how did we get here? And they might spend 15 minutes per person. Some people try to give like the arc of their entire spiritual journey in 15 minutes. Wiser people just start with whatever inspiration comes. And they told their stories to one another. So that's kind of point 5. Point 6 is Father Thomas by himself had been exploring a question before they came. And it was, are there points of agreement between our traditions? Where can we meet? And so he had a kind of draft document that he had been working on called Points of Agreement. And he brought that forward as something for them to pursue. And this became a famous document later on called the Points of Agreement, the Snowmass Points of Agreement, published many different places. And they began to work on these questions. What can we agree about? What are the deep structures of our traditions, to borrow language from Noam Chomsky? Devotion, prayer, non-dualism. These are all structures, and they get looked at differently in each tradition. I'm getting the note that it's time to come in for a landing, so I'll pull this together. They worked on the Points of Agreement, and that was later published. And I realized at a certain point in about 2006, or no, I realized it more recently, I was the last person to work on the Points of Agreement. The final edits to it are mine, and I feel so honored that these individuals came up with these, and I made the final tiny tweaks that are now published in the Common Heart. But Points of Agreement is important, but they later found that differences were also important. When you're in dialogue, you have to go through a small journey, which is very significant, which is we come to the circle, all from the traditions we come from, feeling very different. I do this. I use this different nomenclature. I have this different cultural basis for my practice. You come very different, and then there's a great delight in realizing how similar you are. There's a big smile around it. But there's a more mature dialogue that happens after that, where you realize again, for a second time, that you're different, wonderfully different, wonderfully diverse and nuanced, that God speaks to us in many different ways that are highly individual and very necessary for us to be nuanced. And then the differences are not different, but wonderfully different. And so like the stage of commonality is fantastic, but it's not the final stage. There's a better stage beyond it. And then the last point of a Snowmass dialogue is really that the dialogue is not just the formal sessions of dialogue. It's the meals, it's the friendship, it's the walks, it's the sharing atmosphere and sharing the silent dialogue of practice that they would do together. And they decided that that practice needed to be silent, because silence and mystery are the great place of meeting. Whatever is happening for you internally can be very conditioned by the tradition that you come from. And it can be present in you within the silence, but you're all sharing the silence together and practicing at the same time. Perhaps highly individual things, but you're sharing them in a sense. And so that became the great learning experience of these dialogues. And to the end, Father Thomas, we know, many of us, that he nearly died about 5 times. I can't remember how many times we thought Father Thomas was going to pass, and whether it was 2009, and then he would just have a resurrection, as it were, and come back and be very alive again. But he always came to life for these dialogues to the very end. And my last meetings with him were with regard to these dialogues. And so it's a tremendous legacy. They go on, and in 2016, he passed them on, the legacy of these dialogues, to my foundation partner, Roy McEntee, and myself. And so it still is continuing, the Snowmass legacy. And perhaps I'll end like that. And after our break, anything that you want to ask about the nuance of these things, I'm happy to discuss.
Wow. Thank you so much, Netanel. So let's take a 10-minute break. It'll be silent. Get up, stretch, get your cup of coffee, your water, tea. We'll keep everyone muted. Please stay muted. And we'll start promptly at 10:50. We'll have sufficient time to ask all those pressing questions. And if you want to put some, meanwhile, if you don't want to forget, in the chat, we will facilitate that as well. But please do get up and stretch a little bit and hydrate, and we'll see you shortly. Welcome again, everyone. So let's use the hand icon, or you can put your questions in the chat box. We kindly ask, if we call on you, to please keep your questions concise, to the point, because we're trying to get everyone, to give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions. So let's see. Maybe Ellen, you can help me if you see anyone's hand, if anybody's hand is up. And meanwhile, so there is one from Judy Blanchard. Thank you, Netanel, for sharing. You mentioned that someone can be religious and yet not a contemplative. It is my experience that one can be a contemplative and not religious. I consider myself one of those people. My tribe is Jewish, but I've spent many years on retreat Zen Buddhist monasteries, and for the last 10 years at Snowmass. I would like to see the conversation broaden to include those who, although secular, are quite spiritual. Would you comment on that? Thank you, Julie, for your question. Judy.
Yes. I've been talking mostly about where they were in 1984. Part of the exploration of the dialogue among those who were part of it over time started to tend in this direction. It was not so much the issue then. In 1984, it was these religions meeting and people that represented them meeting and coming to understand one another. Over time, you get some people that, in the language they used back then, who were non-aligned with one tradition or another. And that's more of the dialogue now. So part of the new iteration of the dialogues, as I facilitate them, is really about, I've used this word, interspirituality, which is a catch-all term for a number of complex spiritual identities that are out there. And this is true for most of us today, that even if we're identified with one tradition, we live in a world of a lot of influence and cross-influence and influences that are not even planned. The music that's on the radio. Maybe you're a devoted Christian, but you're singing a Bob Marley song. and there's a kind of influence, as you're singing those lyrics, you're also singing lyrics that have an implicit religious understanding underneath them for the author of them. And so we're just living in that world. Think of our cell phones right now. The signals are passing everywhere. There's no not being a part of it, and we can consider that problematic, but it's just is. It's what's happening. And so this is not where they were at, but in 2016, I went to Father Thomas and I said, the dialogue is about something different now. It's about these complex spiritual identities. And the people that come to the dialogue don't need to necessarily represent a religion, but they should be deep practitioners that represent some such complex identity. Sometimes, they might be like Father Kennedy, who's also a recognized Zen Roshi. What does that even mean? How can one be both? How can one be both without two traditions, each of those traditions suffering some harm or being done anemically? That is not a dismissive comment, but it's a very real comment for people that have to live these complex identities. How is my spiritual life rich when it's not one thing anymore? And so the dialogue is really today about how to come to terms with those issues. However, from my perspective, some of the definitions are a little different. So I like to speak about religion and spirituality. There's a lot of talk about spiritual but not religious today. And I understand what that means. It means there are things I'm dissatisfied with, and there are things that are essential to my being that I feel genuinely spiritual. I always likened it to Jesus saying, and she chose the better part. Well, the better part is spirituality. On the other hand, it's very difficult for somebody to answer the question, how are you spiritual but not religious? They either become very vague, or they start referring to things, modalities that come from the religions, which suggests to me that religion is a modality, a vehicle for cultivating spirit. And so anything that you do to cultivate that experience of spirit is religious. And so those two things are relationship words. They're in relationship. And even as simple as, oh, I take a walk to cultivate my spirit. That would be the religious element, the functional technology of cultivating the spirit, which does not have to be bound to dogma. So we don't necessarily, have to be stuck in the religious dogmas, but there's almost no escaping the spiritual technologies that have been cultivated in our religions. And some of us can be very at home in those traditions still. I was just kind of forced into some hyphenization. Here I'm a Christian who learns that he's Jewish. And so that's a complex identity that I have to learn to navigate. Unless I want to, as some people would insist, be forced into the situation of just dismissing one or the other. But they wouldn't be true for me. I had a true experience of genuine connection to both. And so now I have to explore from that place. It's actually the only place of integrity for me to explore from is from the tension and not dismissing. So that's more of the dialogue today. I could go on the whole time about that. So I'll move.
Thank you. Thank you. So Maggie has a question. Maggie, you can unmute yourself.
Good morning. Thank you. I really appreciated and enjoyed your presentation discussion of the Snowmass dialogues. At one point, I think I heard you say that for Pat Johnson, becoming a contemplative grew out of her experience of service, particularly to her children and to the convening, whichever convening it was that you mentioned that she tended to. And I'm very curious about that. In my day job, I'm an administrator I engage volunteers for a big social service agency. And I see that the people who volunteer, like, they're looking for something. And, I think a lot about, service and reflection, how they need to go together to enhance and enrich one another. So I'm just curious to hear you talk about that a tiny bit.
I think that may have been more implied in what I said. The first thing she did was serve that retreat that Father Thomas was holding, and then she got herself into it. She was bringing the food and making sure they had what they needed. But I think there was a connection for her. But I think I asked her directly about this, and it was also very clear that she came to a realization that it wasn't just service. That was not enough. In fact, she told me an interesting little anecdote about going to Father Thomas, and they had a very close relationship, and telling him how overwhelmed she was in her life and the caretaking of her children, and she was already meditating probably 2 hours a day somehow in that very busy life. And she said he suggested that she needed to meditate 3 hours a day. And she said it seemed very counterintuitive that her life was already very busy. But what she said about that was he was right. What that time spent meditating represented was time for her. That if she didn't take more time for her, is what he was telling her, that she was not going to feel better. So inasmuch as that was the great time of inner cultivation that made her feel better, she needed to take more of it, which was really interesting. So she thought that time meditating, clearly doing centering prayer was very important, but then the service is an extension of it. Because as I like to say, we train for the race. You know, a person that's training for a marathon gets up and runs every day, so that on the day of the race, they have the capacity to run it. What we know about the original marathon, that guy died.
You should have trained.
He didn't train. Luckily, he had to tell about the invasion of the Persian army or whatever it was, and he ran the 26 miles. He ran that marathon, and he died at the end. We train for the race. We train daily so that we have the capacity to meet the needs of our life. Spiritual practice is not for the cushion. The cushion is for life. Like, we cultivate these qualities in order to be able to use them in life, not to escape life, to be on the cushion, you know, and to get some peace. The peace we get there is to bring to the world. And so there's a relationship here between why we do our practice and who we're doing it for. And it turns out to be, in the end, not for us, not for ourselves. It's not what's being sold on Yoga Journal, that, you know, you can, you know, do these mudras and have a little peace in your life and you'll feel better from the stress of your life. It's not for us. We cultivate something to make the world better. It also benefits us, but it's not for us. And it's not, certainly not to escape the world, because if it's to escape the world, then you just have this dualism that continues. And you're participating in it. It means you're doing your spiritual practice. If you're doing it to escape, then you're doing it according to the shape of our pathological society.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do your spiritual practice as a radical act of subversion, to bleed that spirituality back into it. And so with regard to service, it's like we're doing it to build the capacity to serve well. And I think, you know, a lot of modern spirituality gives people the idea like, oh, you do your practice and then you reach enlightenment and then you teach people, like that's the goal. And that seems completely backward. Teaching, in the way Father Thomas taught, is a vocation and a burden, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And it should feel like a burden, because it is. And if it feels like an ego boost, then you're probably doing it wrong, because it's actually a responsibility and a burden. And it's also a vocation. And not everybody has that vocation. The goal of spiritual practice is to become mature, and then to allow the world to benefit from that maturity. And so, like, we don't need more spiritual teachers. We need more spiritual accountants. We need more spiritual chefs. We need more spiritual custodians. You want people that have deep, cultivated contemplative practices in teaching grade school and helping us with our taxes, because that's the subversive activity the world needs. It needs us to bring our contemplative activity into it, into a very jaded world where we expect people to do the wrong thing. But we send these subversive contemplatives back into it and they do better. And so I think that should be our goal, to be, you know, sleeper agents of contemplative spirituality in every aspect of life. That's my long answer to that question. Sorry.
I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So Benedict also put in the comment section, could you please comment on your own experience with the role of centering prayer, contemplation in facilitating interfaith dialogue?
This is I can speak about this from two perspectives. One innovation that my partner and I made in the dialogues is that in the Snowmass dialogues, they eventually agreed to meet in silence. And so they would have a special session, or maybe 2 sessions a day during their week together, where they would sit in silence together. We brought this session of silence away from being a special session to we started every dialogue session with silence. And so we didn't begin a session without sitting for 20 minutes in silence together. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the silence then conditions the kind of words that follow it. It's like something coming into the light out of darkness. We live in a world of talking, but we don't really communicate that much. And there's something about how hard it is to utter a word after long silence, that it has to come, it tends to come from depth. And you almost don't want to disturb the silence or break it with anything unworthy of that stillness. And so the words that follow silence tend to be better words and have not only better articulation, but they come with a quality, a whatness, that's what quality means. That is, words can carry a motive quality. We know this. People can just talk. I could open Father Thomas's book of profound readings and just go, in the New Testament, faith usually translates to best, to blah, 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 blah. I can just say it in a way the words are just words, or I can say, in the New Testament, faith usually translates best. Our words can carry power. And they tend to do that better following silence. So that's one of the things that we did. We brought the silence into the dialogue and started the dialogue with periods of 20 minutes silence. Now, the role of centering prayer in facilitating interfaith dialogue, we're usually just emphasizing silence. We're not prescribing anything. However, in interspiritual circles that I'm often in, where I don't know from what religious or spiritual framework someone is arriving, I don't know whether they're Christian or Jewish or Buddhist, they have a seat at the table as an individual. And in as much as centering prayer's framework and its language is Christian, in that we talk about, the workings of the Spirit and consenting to God, I sometimes give a version of the practice that you could call interspiritual. So I ask people to, allow a symbol to arise, just as we do. But now in a group that who knows where they're coming from, it could be Buddhist, that symbol might be an Om. That symbol might be any, a word, it could be Dharma. And I'm not there to look in on their inner lives or in on their hearts to what symbol they're using. So you see in this way, the framework of centering prayer, we all have those individual symbols no matter what. Even if we're doing it in a Christian context, we don't know what one another's symbols are. And this makes the practice also very applicable when you're sitting with people who might not be Christian, but they can allow their symbol to arise. And even if you're Christian, you trust that that's the workings of the Spirit. Whatever allows that to arise and whatever does arise, that's what's there for them to work with. And so I sometimes lead the practice that way and say, and whatever that symbol is for you, that you can allow it in and then not hold it and watch your process and be with the not holding. And whenever you find that you've become distracted or engaging thoughts, feelings, or sensations, allow that symbol to come back and then not hold it. So centering prayer is also, if you drop a few words here and there for mixed company, you might say, is a very usable practice interspiritually for a mixed group. In fact, I find it a profound extension of centering prayer is this capacity for being able to do it with anyone. And it's the kind of practice we need today, because many of our meditation practices are, you might call them masculine, in a simple way from this perspective. They're concentrative. They're based on grabbing. Grab a word, hold it. A mantra practice is about replacing a myriad of thoughts with one better thought, right? But that's still trying to train our minds according to its pattern, which is grabbing. We grab things. Centering prayer is not that. Centering prayer is, you might call feminine or receptive meditation, and there are a rare set of techniques across our religious traditions which are receptive, which are based on building the capacity to not hold, to not grab, but to be with, and to make space for, and to allow something to arise within. And that makes it a very profound practice today, because with these concentrated practices, we're really just learning to do what we already do as humans, grab. And it seems to me the thing that we need to learn to do as humans now is not grab. To learn to make room and feel into the spaciousness, what the workings of the Spirit want to arise. We're too focused on working our own problems, and we need to work on our own stuff, but we'll never fix it ourselves. Centering prayer allows us to get worked, to get churned, to be part of God's process where we realize, we're not God. We don't make it all happen. We have to be in relationship and allow ourselves to get spiritually massaged, as it were, to work those things out. So I use centering prayer in an interspiritual context also. And I'm big with the long answers. Sorry.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Richard Hall, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. You use the term subversive contemplatives. What's the relationship of these subversive contemplatives to the institutional church, the institutional Christian church, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if we're talking about the institutional church, it's no different than it's ever been in terms of subversive contemplatives. They've always been considered subversive. The mystics, they have a very odd relationship to the church, usually contentious when they're alive. And then some 2 centuries on, the church claims them as, saints. That's an interesting tension and an interesting pattern. I think it's very healthy for the institutional church to have subversive contemplatives, because what they're really being subversive about is wanting their spiritual lives to be real and wanting it to be truly impactful for everyone, kind of democratizing spirituality and wanting people to have the best resources for dealing with the difficulty of our human lives. And which is to say, they just want the religion to work for people, for themselves and for others. And so they become dissidents by accident, by becoming dissatisfied with how some institutional structures seem to be failing in that task that they're supposed to be succeeding at. And so, to my mind, the subversive contemplative is really the greatest advocate for the church. I just did a podcast with one of my best friends, Father Adam Bucko, and we were talking about there is in Christianity an exemplary model set by Jesus, and it's a subversive model. When Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" and the answer is, "Well, you're, this elevated being." And he basically responds, "Well, if you say that I am that, then do as I do." And then he washes their feet. If you say that I'm that, then do as I do. And then he provides this subversive example. And he says, love one another as I have loved you. And that's created a pattern in Christianity of dissatisfaction. Because that pattern is there, that archetype is there from Christ himself, then we become more aware of a kind of cognitive dissonance around when the church is not that. It becomes so obvious and unacceptable because the archetype is set by Christ. Serve, love one another, do this inner cultivation. And when it doesn't seem to be asked for or supported, then in order to be a good Christian, you have to be subversive against that. So it's an interesting archetype that's set up from the beginning. And that's really what I mean. It's like, in order to be a true Christian, sometimes you are subversive against the institution for its betterment, for wanting it to be what it should be.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have 1 minute, and I believe Susie Kinderwater has a question.
Thank you. Netanel, thank you so much for being here today. Common Heart and the dialogues have been so nourishing and validating for me as I explored my own interspiritual connections. As you were talking about you carrying on the legacy, I was wondering, is there anything available about what you're doing, any of the substance of what you're doing, anything being shared?
Well, this is my 1 minute answer. That's always the question. And I never have a satisfying answer because they have remained private dialogue retreats. However, I don't think that we need to hide them the way they felt some need to hide. We do record them now. It's just that we've never done anything with the content. But more recently, we held an extension of the dialogues called the Thomas Keating Interspiritual Seminars, where some of us dialogued and gave presentations to each other. And we're going to make those presentations and that dialogue available in a book form. But it is a question that we keep exploring. How can people have some taste of what this is like? And the other way we're intending to do that is bring more of the dialogical method cultivated by Father Thomas and others to small group process. We want to teach people how to do this kind of dialoguing. And I think that will be the tangible outgrowth here. We'll try to create some products of what has happened, but I think teaching people about the way to dialogue is really the way to go, and to hold meditation space and then and then have contemplative speaking after it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions. And thank you, Netanel.
Yes.
So let us kind of settle back in. And Netanel will now lead us into our second centering prayer sit.
And I'm going to repeat the prayer from the Cloud of Unknowing. It is just one of my favorite prayers, and I think it says as much as you can say about what we're attempting to do. So addressing God. O God, unto whom all hearts lie open, and unto whom desire is eloquent, and from whom no secret thing is hidden. Purify the thoughts of my heart by the outpouring of your Spirit, that I may love you with a perfect love and praise you as you deserve. Amen.
Our retreat now draws to a close. On behalf of the Contemplative Outreach of Maryland and Washington Coordinating Committee, everyone participating today, and all those who are listening to this recording, we thank Professor Netanel Miles-Yepez for gifting us with time and his wisdom. I also would like to remind you all that we are celebrating ComW's 25th anniversary. So do also consider doing a small donation in honor of a loved one and to also help keep the work ongoing. Netanel will now lead us in a closing blessing.
This is a prayer I wrote with my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, a kind of universal prayer. Source of time and space, our sovereign Father and Mother, draw down to us the great renewal, a stream from the infinite attuning us to your timely intent. Let wisdom flow into our awareness, awakening us to foresight, guiding us to help instead of harm. May every tool and device of human use be sparing and protecting of your creation. Help us to set right all that we have debased, to heal what we have made ill, to care for and restore what we have injured. Bless the earth, our home, guide us in how to care for her, so we might live according to your promise, days of heaven here on earth. May all the beings you have fashioned become aware of you, and the gift of being you grant them in every moment. May we realize the shaping of our lives, and may everything that breathes share breath and knowing, delighting in the one great breath. Guide us in the understanding of the art of partnering with family, with friends, and with neighbors new and old. Aid us in dissolving old enmities. May we come to honor, even in those whom we fear, your image and form, your light dwelling in their hearts. May our star soon rise on the day when your house will indeed be a house of prayer for all peoples, named and celebrated in every tongue. On that day, you will be known as one with all cosmic life. Amen.